I want to just preface my comments with just a few things, and I want everyone to understand very clearly that when I make these observations about the history of this land, I'm talking about someone who is native to this land. I'm talking about someone who has had the opportunity to travel to many nations across this earth, many Muslim countries as well. But I've almost, if anybody has seen this movie called The Wizard of Oz, I'm almost like that character in The Wizard of Oz called Dorothy, when she was transported to a foreign, strange place where everything seemed to be turned upside down, and she turned to her little puppy at one point and said, "Toto, this ain't Kansas no more." So everywhere that I've been on this earth, I've had this experience of how different our Muslim lands and what happens in these countries, how different it may be from this country, but I still have wanted to come back to this land because I'm a native of this soil. And I believe that just like you and I are sitting in this country today, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given a very clear reason why we should be here. And part of that reason I want, as we go a little longer in this discussion, to talk about how our presence here today is so linked to the past as well as to the present and the rebirth of this nation, to live out the ideals that it truly can live out. Brothers and sisters, talking just briefly, I want to just go back just a little bit in time. I made the statement that there's hardly been a time when Muslims have not walked across the North American soil. I want to just give you just a little bit of evidence so you don't think I'm just coming up here talking crazy. When we look into the history of North America and look at what has been documented, we find that hundreds of years before Chris, the great explorer, got lost and bumped into the so-called New World in 1492, that there are documents in the land of China that say that Chinese explorers, Chinese Muslims explorers, had sailed across the Pacific and landed into the North American continent and then sailed back to China, hundreds and hundreds of years before Columbus was even born. We have in the history amongst the Muslims of Andalusia, we have very clear evidence that our Muslim brothers from al-Masudi documenting this event, that in 889 of the Common Era, that Muslims sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, came to this area of North America, turned around on their ships and sailed back across the Atlantic Ocean. And how do we know it? We know it because of the documentation, and we know because of what they brought back with them as they sailed across the Atlantic. You and I know, when we take the time to just look at how long Muslims have crossed this plain of North America, we also know that there was a time when Muslims coming out of Al-Andalus, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, we know about their crossing. We know about West African Muslims coming from the Empire of Mali, sailing across the Atlantic as early as 1312 of the Common Era, interacting with the indigenous population, marrying amongst the indigenous population, bringing elephants, bringing corns, leaving these things behind in what we now call North America. You and I know, when we turn the pages, more than millions of African slaves were transported during the transatlantic slave trade and dumped into America. The documentation shows that maybe now 1 out of every 3rd African that was brought to this country as a slave was a Muslim. And we know the stories about so many of them. We know about the immigration coming from the Middle East, coming from the subcontinent, of our brothers and sisters coming into this land in gigantic waves over the years and populating the United States. So when I say that there has hardly been a time when Muslims have not walked across this land, it's not just a Muslim myth. It's something that can be documented by the history of this land.